flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. We started looking at Isaiah last week, and the idea of Isaiah is that the Lord is sovereign, and that regardless of what kingdom is in power, we know that God has perspective, and that his eternal plan would eventually come about through Jesus Christ. He talks to his people who don't really see themselves for what they are. And I think for any of us today, and this sounds a little bit preachy, but we sometimes get sort of filled with our own circumstance and don't realize that we're just part of God's circumstance. The three promises that were made to Abraham are still in play here. So he had the promise of the land. They are on the land. Right now we're in the period of the divided kingdom. He's talking to Jerusalem and Judah. They were the southern portion of the divided kingdom. They probably didn't really think of themselves as being in the divided kingdom. They probably were more self-centered, thinking they were the kingdom. But God cared about both southern Judah and northern Israel. The idea that they were 100 years, maybe 150 years from a judgment that he's going to talk about wasn't in their minds. I expected that they felt content, they felt settled, they lived amongst a world that was very unsettled at this time. There were threats from the Syrians at this time. There were threats from the south, from the east, from the west. But yet they believed in containment. That is, that they're God's people. When he talks about them in chapter 1, he was not holding back. He's letting them know that their hearts are impure, that they have ceremonial or maybe even tokens of worship that might indicate religious people, but God's not pleased with it. And it's critical. And that the only thing which God holds for them, which is filled with hope, is what's going to come through the third promise. The third promise to Abraham was the seed. That's the offspring of Abraham, by which and through which every family of the earth would be blessed. And really, I believe that that's the biggest portrait that we have in the book of Isaiah, is the portrait of Jesus Christ. There was a second promise that God made to Abraham, and that was the nation itself, the people. In this section of Isaiah chapter 2, the first 5 verses, he talks about the people. He talks about the house of the Lord, the people of the Lord. But yet, as he addresses the people that were in Isaiah's time, he's again not pleased. From my perspective, he's telling them that your outlook and your salvation isn't going to be because of who you are. It's going to be because of who God is. That's what it's going to be. If you've gone through the book of Romans, and several of you have, in Romans chapter 3, let God be true and every man a liar. Sometimes people think that the tail wags the dog. In other words, if Israel is this, that's what God has to deal with. And they think that no matter what we do, even if we sin, we wear it well enough that God will still hold us, that God will carry us, that God will preserve us. And what we have in the book of Isaiah is that we have a just God, and he's willing to judge his own people. And while that might make us clench our jaw and swallow hard hearing it, that is who our God is. So let's look back at the language, Isaiah chapter 2. What he says in verse 2, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains and shall be lifted up above the hills. Thinking about mountains and the idea, continuing in verse 3, and many people shall come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion, referring to the mountain again, shall go forth the law, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So the theme of mountains throughout this section, if you look back at the law of Moses, that being received at a mountain, when we think about the setting of King David on Mount Zion, but then in contrast, the nations that surrounded them probably had bigger mountains. If you look at Lebanon, and he talks about the mountains of Lebanon, that they towered what they would see. And later on in the book of Isaiah, he's going to say that what powered what we see from the standpoint of outward observance among other peoples looks more impressive than what people would see in Jerusalem, or what they would see even with the whole nation of Israel. But he says, this is the mountain of the house of the Lord. So we had just gone through the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2, when he said that there would be a mountain. The Lord would have a mountain. That mountain would supersede the kingdoms of Babylon and Greece, the kingdom of the Medo-Persians, the kingdom of Rome, the mountain of the Lord that's cut out without hands. He refers to it as a mountain. So we're thinking about something that's big, something that's towering, something that's going to be impressive. And the Lord says, I'm going to speak to you in your own terms. So he does. And he's letting them know that, as Daniel did, that the Lord's going to be the most impressive mountain. And when he refers to this place, it seems to be geographical because he mentions Zion, but it's also from the standpoint of figure, the standpoint of concept, that he shall establish himself as the highest of the mountains. It'll be lifted up above the hills. Verse 2, in case we get ahead of ourselves, it says, it shall come to pass in the latter days. If you listen to Jimmy's presentation on Daniel, what are the latter days sometimes referred to? There's 2 or 3 answers to this. Anyone? When you talk about the last days, what'd you say? Judgment. All right, a judgment. And I'm going to say a judgment because in listening to Jimmy, he was talking about judgment that would come against Israel itself. The introduction of the gospel meant that there would be the end of the political state of the nation of Israel. He says, in the latter days. I'm going to put that period simply because some of the things of which he then describes are concurrent with the coming of Jesus Christ the first time. And then we see the launching of the gospel of Jesus. So he says the latter days. We see that expression also given by Joel. We see it given by several prophets, and that was quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 2. In the last days, this is what's going to happen. So in the last days of something, oftentimes it is in the latter days. It could refer to latter days coming up to Babylonian captivity. Could refer to the close of Israel's political state. That would be the time of Jesus and the launching of the gospel. Yes, Pat.
Well, I think it also does refer to judgment, but I think also just simply the idea of a time of fulfillment. He is referring to a time in the future where these prophecies are going to be fulfilled.
All right, so it's not going to be now, but it will be a time of which this will be fulfilled. That's good, Pat. Why that's helpful now, Pat's saying it's a time of fulfillment of which he doesn't necessarily identify. We don't always know, reading through the book of Isaiah. It could be talking about as they come into the assault of the Assyrians, or as they come into the assault of the Babylonians. It could be as they come to the end of the political state of Israel. That was within the first century and the launching of the gospel. But it is going to be a time of fulfillment. The reason why we mention that is sometimes people believe, and I have acquaintances that believe that what is being said here in Isaiah chapter 2, and also Micah, who was a contemporary, said some of the same things, is that this is going to be the state of Jesus' reign on the earth. That it's going to be the last days. Some of these folks are called premillennialists. I really don't even hear that word very much. And I talked to quite a few people one-on-one, the idea of premillennialists, but if I ask them, I say, well, what do you think's about to happen? And they look at all the conditions of the world right now, and they're thinking, well, I think we're going to start the last days. We're going to start the last days. And they think that Jesus is going to come back to the earth, and that there's going to be a utopia, there's going to be a peaceful arrangement, and that's what they're thinking about. I don't believe he's talking about that. And one of the reasons being is because of the description of what was going to exist as far as peacefulness, as far as the launching of the message of God, but also that all nations would come to it. Some of those things are answered for us in the New Testament. From the standpoint of those who were in the city of Jerusalem and in Judah at this time, I don't believe they probably grasp really what's being said. And so I asked the question to myself, well, what can they grasp? They can grasp that it's going to be God who is sovereign. They can grasp that it's only God who can grant peace. As you read succeeding chapters, you'll see that they're told basically everything else they would lean on is going to fail them. So they could grasp this. So with what they knew, by the way, Abraham, who lived a couple of thousand years before Jesus Christ, was a tower of faith, and he had a whole lot less information than what we have. These people at this point, they have more information over 1,000 years later than Abraham had. They can anchor themselves on that faith. But because I say that we see so many of these things which are identified in the New Testament as we read these succeeding verses, it seems to be the period of time that is at the launching of the gospel of Jesus. I'll go to verse 3. He says, and many people shall come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So the launching of the gospel would be that the word would come forth. If you've seen Acts chapter 1 and Jesus telling his apostles that they remain in the city of Jerusalem, and then from there they would go in Judea, Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth, he says this is going to go everywhere. You don't see that anywhere else before that time. That is an evangelistic message. What you see is more of a closed-in society, Israel. They could be a light before others. And in Old Testament prophets, we read that God expected them to be a light before others. But they weren't really recruiting people to a codified law of Moses. Here we see that a law goes forth, whereas the Israelites did not have that. So in the dispensation, the administration of Jesus Christ, what you have is a law. It's called in Scripture perfect law of liberty. It's not the codified law of Moses. It's God's rule is what it is. And it's powerful. It's the paths by which God leads his people. And so others would look to it. They would want it. They would want to be led by it. In the previous chapter, Isaiah, we can see where God's own people didn't want it. But he said, you're going to find people that want it. And then it's going to go forth. In the New Testament, one of the best examples of how this gets propelled quickly is Acts chapter 8, where you see Philip teaching the Ethiopian eunuch. And here is a eunuch that I'm assuming is a non-Jew. He is in the book of Isaiah, and he doesn't understand who's being spoken about as a servant of the Lord. And of course, Philip opens his mouth, preaches unto him Jesus. Then the eunuch takes the message back to Ethiopia. And then we see otherwise in the New Testament, Acts chapter 8, we're going into places like Samaria, also into Syria, like Antioch, Syria, that the gospel gets there en route by sometimes apostles, sometimes evangelists, sometimes people who are traveling Christians, but it's going to go everywhere. And that's only in the gospel, the launching of the gospel. And so that's why I put it into that space. The other is what he says in verse 3, and many peoples shall come. Many peoples. So universally, the application of the gospel is for Jew, Greek, for male, female, for bond, for free. The seed promise was not to the house of Israel. The seed promise was to all people. That's what we have through Jesus Christ that began with the gospel message. Acts chapter 10, when Peter's at the house of Cornelius, that God is not a respect of persons, but men who fear God from all nations can receive the salvation that comes through Jesus Christ, all nations. That's a universal message. I read that and I see it and I understand it, and yet for some reason still the Jews would have a perspective of they were it and nobody else mattered. And God is saying in Romans chapter 11 that you were it, but you're not it anymore. The Gentiles can be it, and you may not. Israel was the natural branch. The Gentiles were grafted in. God is saying that the message goes out to all. I could also think from the perspective of my own neighborhood and wondering who should be saved and who shouldn't. You know, we look at people of different race, people of different cultures, and we're thinking, should I really care about them? And this answers it right here. It's many peoples. The determining factor is not, again, whether you're Jew or Gentile, male or female, whether you're bond or free. The determining factor here is that someone goes because they want God to teach us His ways. So we see there, continue verse 3, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that He may teach us His ways, and that we may walk in His paths. That's the determining factor. People want what God gives. They want God's truth. Jesus said, seek and you shall find. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It's not the condition of our environment. It's the condition of our heart that determines if we can receive what God gives through the gospel. So I appreciate what the prophet is saying here, because it's certainly applicable to us today. What he says in verse 4, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So he's talking about a time of peace. The only time of which I can see that exists is in the gospel among the community of God. That's the only time of which I can see that. I don't see any condition through the period of Isaiah of which they constructed peace to some degree. If you think that there was peace, even when there was Roman dominion over the promised land, there was not peace at that time. There was always hostility. It's been asked to me in the last 20 years especially, but even in the last 48 hours, will there ever be peace between Israel and the Arabs. Will there ever be peace? And my response is Israel can't get along with itself. The Arabs can't get along with themselves, much less with each other. It's hostile. It's very hostile. And what peace is being promised by God through the prophet Isaiah is that there will not be weapons of carnal warfare. That's the peace that he's promising. But he's not promising that from the standpoint of military action. He's talking about a peace, a unity that exists, like Ephesians chapter 2, that there's not going to be any hostility between a man and his God, and there's not going to be hostility between the Jew and the Gentile. That's a peace that's only found in Jesus Christ. That's a peace that's within. And so you see that as a common message throughout the entire gospel, that you have this peace. It doesn't exist militarily in any time. It didn't exist in the time of Jesus as he walked on earth. Any time before that, it has not existed in any time after that. Yes, Drew.
Is this promise of peace more understood by most people that study this verse in Isaiah? Like you're talking about through Christ?
I'm sorry, Drew. Did you...
Is what you're saying a promise of peace through the unity of Christ? Is this more understood when people study this, do you think?
I don't know that it's more understood. I believe that it's being promised here, so it is a promise. I believe it's more understood with the revelation of Jesus Christ into the New Testament. I'm not sure what they grasp during the time of Isaiah, but yeah, it's being promised here. The prediction that there would be no military warfare among God's people, I don't know that they can understand that. Moving into the New Testament time, there was always going to be some kind of external conflict. Even among those who would be God's people, they're going to be the object of carnal attacks from their own family. Jesus said, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. A man's foes shall be those of his own household. So I don't know that they understood at that time. As far as us, I'm going to try to answer your question, Drew. If it was a question. But the helping us understand it more, I don't know that it helps me understand it more, it helps me appreciate it more. Because it was always in the mind of God. I believe it's figurative speech when he says in verse 4, he shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. I don't believe they were actually going to become farmers as opposed to an army. Their spears into pruning hooks. A nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Neither shall they learn war anymore. I was thinking about the time of which existed a couple of hundred years before Jesus came to earth, and what you had was the Greek Empire, then you had the imposing Roman Empire that came in, and among the Israelites at that time you had militants, people that were involved in guerrilla warfare. They were thinking we have to be militant, we have to fend for what's right for God, what's right for us. They were willing to fight against the influences of the Greeks at that time. Always something in their mind. Even Peter, when they were apprehending Jesus Christ, takes his sword and evidently tries to kill one of the officers that was making the apprehension at that time, cuts off his ear, but I think he was going for his head, the whole thing. He's thinking, we've got to take up arms. And so again, the idea of the Israelite was it's them against us. It's the other nations against us. And he's saying, no, if we truly come to God and other people come to God, then what we have is peace. And so you look at somebody that was from Ethiopia or someone that was from the Orient or from Asia Minor. We're talking about people of Ephesus, maybe people from Athens, Greece, that would have formerly been the foe. He says, now who are they? He says, they can be Christians. They can be the family of God. We're not thinking any kind of military combat against them. So this is very unique, but also it's a promise. Anything else about the first 5 verses? Yes, great.
I think it's interesting, he talks about being at the top of the mountain and all the nations shall flow to it. It's just the opposite of the way that you would think, everything flows through the valley.
Right.
But it's God, and he's making that happen. He's making this come about in a way that's kind of foreign to us, this way nature works.
Right. So it is an interesting concept that they flow up. And a lot of that has to do with if your God is at the top of your mountain, that's where you're going to go. You're going to go. But yeah, we gravitate toward that message, the message that's the mountain of the house of God. We are drawn to it. So that is interesting. All right, later we see in chapter 2, he says in verse 6, for you have rejected your people, the house of Jacob. That's speaking of the Lord. Because they are full of things from the east and of fortune tellers like the Philistines. They strike hands with the children of foreigners. Their land is filled with silver and gold, and there is no end to their treasures. Their land is filled with horses, and there is no end to their chariots. Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. So man is humbled, and each one is brought low. Do not forgive them. Enter the rock and hide in the dust. From before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, the haughty looks of man shall be brought low. The lofty pride of men shall be humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. I said a moment ago, it's hard to know the period of time of which sometimes he speaks of a day of the Lord or a latter day, but this one might be the next one that's coming around, that for Judah and for Jerusalem is going to be the captivity that takes them into Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar comes and he is able to overthrow the city of Jerusalem, and then he orders the capture of thousands of Israelites. They're taken off into captivity. The city of Jerusalem is burned down. It might have reference to that. Some of the confidence of which the people of God had was constructed because they had made peace with their neighboring idolatrous people. Peace with such folks, as he says, to the east, such folks as to the west. To the west would have been the Philistines, and to the east it would have been the neighboring countries of Ammon and Moab. They, to the north, would try to gain alliances, and also to the south with Egypt. He said that all of this had given them a good business sense, and it had given them confidence because they had a respectable net worth, and they were in their own mind well set. But everything here violates the relationship they have with God on several fronts, one of which is idolatry. Another one would be materialism, trusting what God had given them versus trusting the God who gave it. They were told not to make alliances with neighboring nations, but yet that's what they had. This was a time of which they thought their success was its own evidence that God was taking care of them, and their success was not that. That's true sometimes in the New Testament. You take a rich man, such as Jesus spoke about in Luke chapter 12, versus Lazarus, or Luke chapter 16 rather, and you would think that the rich man was an indication of the blessings of God, and actually the outcome was just the opposite after he died versus the state of Lazarus after he died. What we have, our net worth, what externally looks like success, does not tell the whole story. Verse 12, he says, for the Lord of hosts has a day. He says, against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. He says, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the lofty mountains, against all the uplifted hills, against every high tower, against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, against all the beautiful craft, and the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the lofty pride of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. I'll stop there at verse 17, having finished that. Notice that this is a contrast to the mountain of the Lord, of which he says is going to be established. It's eternally established. It's the sovereignty of God. It's the glory of God. Versus all that which surrounded them, which again would bespeak success in their era. And he says God is going to bring all that down. Even looking to the west, if they look to the ships that would harbor along the Mediterranean, and they would say that's an indication of commerce and luxury, he said God will be against that. Nothing that is fortified against God is going to stand. And then verse 18, when he says the idols shall utterly pass away. It's thought that the idols, and usually when Isaiah speaks of idols, he's speaking about how futile the people of God are. The first two commands of the Ten Commandments was not to bow down before any of the gods, not to make any other gods, to have any graven image. And you wouldn't think that you'd have to tell an Israelite those two commandments. Both of those, by the way, are in the Ten Commandments preface with, I am the Lord your God. That's the prefacing of all the commandments. I am the Lord your God. So since you know who I am, then all of this behavior and all of these attitudes should be consistent with who I am. So sometimes they got into the behavior, the attitudes. But the first two, it was all about idolatry. And he's saying they're not going to hold to those anymore. So from our observation, not just the prophecy here, but from our observation, the children of Israel, in about 605, 607 BC, 140 years after this, 150 years after this, they're taken to Babylonian captivity. And then the remnant at that point no longer holds to idols. He says that's what's going to happen. We know that there's such a thing as mental idolatry. Later among Christians, they're told not to practice idolatry, Colossians chapter 3. Covetousness, which is idolatry. We understand that those concepts exist. But he says the time will come when people will learn their lesson. The idea that people are just going to have to learn here is going to be demonstrated by the fact that they won't learn until there's been several funerals. So if we're talking 150 years off before Judah is taken into captivity, they didn't learn. Subsequent generations will. We've had conversations the last couple of weeks, especially thinking about the remnant that was taken off into Babylonian captivity. Of the 50 or 60,000 that are taken into that captivity, how many of these were people of faith? So not even all those learned, but their behavior complied with no more idols at that time. And so people are difficult to change. We go to Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 19. He says, and people shall enter the caves of rocks and the holes of ground, and before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. God's not really here to threaten the physical sphere. What he was here was to judge the people. That oftentimes here and throughout prophets of the Old Testament, and also such as the book of Revelation, we see where it indicates that the judgment is against the sphere itself, the cosmos. But he's here so that he can issue a judgment upon the people. And in verse 20, In that day mankind will cast away their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they had made for themselves to worship, to the moles and to the bats. I'll stop right there for a second. There's a comma there before we begin verse 21, but the futility of idols. Oftentimes we think academically, and this is not a polite word, but idols are stupid. And everyone academically can see idols are stupid. But people aren't driven by intellect. People aren't driven by logic. People are driven by affection. It's not concrete. It's something that's a concept. And so idols creep into the conversation. Idols creep into lives. And he's saying, throw those images over there where the bats and the moles are. Because they'll get just as much good out of them as you will. And we'll see certain descriptions like that. I think there's a lot of humor in the Bible. This may be one of them. How things are just idiotic. But he said, you've made these idols of silver, idols of gold. You've worshiped them. He says, cast them away to the moles and to the bats. Verse 21, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. Stop regarding man in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he? So there's an indication of things that will be driven home more, that they go looking for refuge against what? Against the judgment of the Lord. It's sort of like when you turn the lights on and all the cockroaches look for, some place to hide. And that's exactly what's happening. The light is shining now, the terror of the Lord. By the way, those who are in faith are not in any way wanting to restrict the judgment of God. Those who are in faith. 1 John chapter 4, that perfect love cast out fear. It's talking about the Lord's going to bring a judgment. The judgment of the Lord was not something of which they were, I would say, concerned about in Egypt. When we had the Passover, of which the door of each people's house was protected with the blood of the sacrificial lamb. And someone says, well, God's judgment is coming. Yeah, bring it. Bring God's judgment. But those who are not walking in love, those who are not walking in reverence of God, will fear this judgment. This context is talking about the Israelites, God's people, and how they're going to look for a place to hide, and it looks cowardly, very cowardly, and that's where they're going to be. Now, as you go through that, if you're looking at ourselves and our Christian life, it's preaching all kinds of sermons to us, but it goes back to the idea of faith and us subscribing to the promise that would come through the Messiah. From the standpoint of application, and I'm all about application, does this describe our life right now as we are in Jesus Christ, as the Messiah has come? Are we seeking the paths of the Lord? Are we looking to unite in spirit with other people, regardless of their background? Are we seeking this? The judgment of the Lord, a day of the Lord, and I don't know how many days of the Lord that God has in mind. He might judge this nation. He might judge my little kingdom called the farm where I live. we don't know what the Lord's got in mind, but we can't depend on our circumstance to dictate the action of God. We need to be careful about that. What else are you seeing there in Isaiah chapter 2?
What, in verse 9 at the end, it says, "But do not forgive them." Is that what you just talked about just letting the judgment come?
Yes. So as you start that sort of paragraph in verse 8, he's talking about the Lord. For you, the Lord, have rejected your people, the house of Jacob. And then he gives a description of their idolatry and their alliances with the neighboring countries. He is saying, and much like David the psalmist did, he's saying, please bring justice, bring vindication. Do not forgive them. Let them go their own way. Let them go their own way. So he's offering them forgiveness. That was offered in chapter 1. He is offering them that. But basically, this is a case of a nation that has signed its own judgment warrant, if you will. And Isaiah the prophet is speaking for the Lord, but speaking to the Lord. And I believe he's saying this. Don't forgive them for this. Let this pass. Let these people be gone and be done, and let's move on with the agenda.
The proud that are abased and the lofty that are humbled, when they're casting away those idols, are they doing it out of reckoning to serve him, or is it, again, are they hiding, they're scared, terrified?
You know, I'm fast forwarding on that because it's going to be another 150 years before that happens, and the way I'm constructing this chapter. But I do believe that some of them are going to get rid of those idols because they have determined their guilt. And if you read Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's making a confession for his whole nation. And so some of them did have that heart of repentance. But I believe others may have just done it because of convenience. That this is the way things are going right now. Whoever is taking the leadership at that time, they don't have a king, but whoever's taking the leadership at the time, maybe prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel, they're saying, we're done with those. Everybody, we are done with those idols, because that's why we're here in Babylon. So it could have been circumstantial or convenience, but I believe because of Daniel's prayer and his confession that many of them did it because of faith.
Could that be like the idea of like on your deathbed or an unexpected mortal wound that you call out to him when you know that your life is leaving you? Is that
We see that here, but again, I don't know. I'd have to make some speculation in that regard. I've talked to people on their deathbed, by the way, and asked them, is there anything you need to come clean with? I mean, it's a good time to do it. Yeah. All right. We've got about 20 seconds. By the way, I didn't get the syllabus out. I was going to email that. It didn't go my way this week, but I'll get that out to you. We'll take a break then. In about 15 minutes, we'll start worship service. Thank you.